There's a small group of people out there who really believe that their daily car needs to be a little bit more special. The sort of people who do not want to see another version of their car in the car park. The kind of people who are willing to pay a premium for a little bit more driver engagement. Or in the case of the GR Corolla, a lot more driver engagement. There is still a rally-derived engine up front. There is still a rally-derived all-wheel drive system underneath. But more importantly, this entire package is designed solely for you to have fun. My name is Aiman Abdullah. This is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our review of the Toyota GR Corolla. Now, the Toyota GR Corolla is based on the 5-door Corolla that we don't get here in Malaysia, although that said, there are plenty of visual cues to let you know that this is not your cooking variety Toyota. So for starters, up front, you get this much more aggressive front end with a large downturn front grille, as well as these huge air intakes up front, which do various things such as improve aerodynamics or channel air to the brakes in order to cool them. Now, because this is based on the hatch, we do get very different headlights, which I think look a lot smarter than the regular one. Although, to be honest, I think this front end treatment is as aggressive as necessary for this hatch. Now, up top, not only do you get this power bulge, not that the 1.6 really needs it, but more importantly, you get these twin air exits out on the top, which channel hot air from the engine bay out over the car. This, of course, improves cooling for the engine, which is very much needed because you'll be ragging the out of this. Now, that aggressive wider front bumper bleeds into these flared wheel arches in order to hide this car's wider track. Both the front and rear axles have been widened in order to improve this car's stability and to lower the center of gravity. Now, beneath those flared wheel arches, you will find 18-inch NK wheels wrapped in Yokohama Advant tires. Now, these are suitably high-performance tires for this model and do provide adequate grip and performance. That said, however, the most eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed that this is not the Yokohama rubber. This particular car rides on Michelin Pilot Sport 5s. The reason for that being there was an event earlier this month that Michelin sponsored, and so they put Michelin tires on this car. This is not delivery spec. Now, as we move down the side, you'll find black wing mirror caps. You'll find that beautiful, lovely, wider lower side skirt, replete with GR4 badging down there. And again, you'll find more of that flared wheel arch evidence back here with a little bit of plastic cladding. But personally, the bits that I like most about this car are things like that functional breather here, which again channel hot air out from the wheels themselves, and of course the all-important GR badge. But it's actually the back end of the GR Corolla that I think is absolutely sensational. The fact that the bodywork leads into the Toyota badge, which is the furthest trailing edge on the boot of this car, I think looks fantastic. And of course, that reworked rear bumper again to integrate more of that aerodynamic trickery just looks absolutely fantastic. Now, there isn't a massive spoiler on this car, which I quite like, because this kind of keeps the car looking rather subtle, if you ask me. Although that said, the triple exit exhaust is anything but, and it sounds fantastic. Now, behind the tailgate, you will find not that much space. Now, although this is supposed to be a family car, and of course it was derived off of a family hatchback, the boot space has been compromised ever so slightly in order to improve performance. So for starters, like I mentioned earlier, this is an all-wheel drive vehicle, and so you have the rear diff and so on eating up into space underneath the boot floor. And the boot floor itself has now been raised in order to make space for this styrofoam piece, as well as the battery, which lives back here in order to improve weight distribution. Now, that said, the overall space isn't unusable. I reckon that you could fit maybe 4 people's worth of luggage for a weekend away in here. Although that said, if you're trying to fit, say, 4 people's worth of luggage for, say, a balik kampung trip, then you might struggle a little bit. That said, however, if you do need more space, you can fold the rear seats 60-40 in order to create this very flat load bay all the way to the back of the rear seats. And at that point, it does become a little bit more usable, a little bit more versatile, as you'd expect from a hatchback. Now, this tailgate has been difficult to close for the entirety we've had it. Now again, the back end of this car, like I said, looks fantastic. Unfortunately, this interior is struggling a little bit. So I'll start with the things that I do like. I appreciate the fact there's red stitching on the leather-wrapped steering wheel and a lovely GR logo on it as well. I love these microfiber seats with this lovely leather inserts and again, more red stitching. I love the fact that you've got this beautiful bucket style seat which holds you very nicely in place with integrated headrests, although you can move them up and down should you want them. There's more red stitching here on the door, and of course the material quality in here is all very good with a lot of soft touch plastic, much like the standard Corolla. The only trouble is there isn't really that much in here that feels very special, because this is ultimately a 350,000 ringgit hatchback and a special edition at that, something that you're not going to be seeing every day, but it just doesn't feel particularly special. Now, that said, however, there are still a few things in here that I do quite like. The fact that there is a manual handbrake here that's necessary for performance cars. Apparently, if you pull this, it will actually disconnect the rear driveline so you can pull adrift, although don't do that in public. And of course, you do get these lovely screens. So this television screen here runs the usual Toyota infotainment system, which more importantly, this time around offers wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which is better than the wired system that we got in the GR Yaris. And of course, there is a 12.3-inch digital instrument cluster up ahead of me, which also runs the very latest software and graphics from Toyota, which I appreciate a lot. This setup, I think, is on par with what you get from premium brands. In fact, you even get the same instrument binnacle from the Lexus LM, which is a 1.4 million ringgit van. Now, of course, if you don't want this, there is also a full color heads-up display, which shows you things like your shift lights as well as various ADAS functionalities, although the unit on this particular car has been burnt out. So I'm quite glad this car comes with a 5-year warranty, because at least that can be replaced. Now, up ahead of me sits a very typical Toyota steering wheel, very similar to what we got again from the GR Yaris, which means you get lots of nice tactile buttons, all very easy to use. And your additional buttons live down here for things like your odometer as well as your IMT or intelligent manual transmission, which helps you to smoothen out your shifts by blipping the throttle, especially when you're shifting down. And here, however, are the more important buttons, which is where you get your traction control off, as well as your drive mode selector. This car comes with normal, sport, and eco. Not that anybody's ever using that. And if you ask me, drive the car in sport all the time, because that's when you get the central exhaust out the rear. That flap opens, and so it creates a little bit more noise. And honestly, it doesn't really come at the detriment of fuel economy, because you're the one shifting the gears. Now, a little bit south of this gear lever, you will find the GR4 knob. Now, this allows you to actually tailor the way the car sends its power. So as standard, the car will send 60% of the power to the front and 40% to the rear. Whereas if you turn the car into a track mode or a more aggressive mode, it goes to 30% at the front and then 70% at the rear. And then if you push for track mode, then it splits the power evenly 50-50 over both axles in order to give you the maximum attack and the maximum grip when you're driving very, very exuberantly. And I can attest that turning this knob does make a huge difference. Now, aside from that, I will point out this is still supposed to be a family car, which means that there are still practical reliances and requirements here. So you have a 12-volt socket back here, as well as a USB-C port. There is a USB-A port coming out of this head unit, although honestly no one's ever going to be using that. There are a couple of cup holders here, which is suitable for a smart tag. You have a bottle holder here, big enough for a 1.5 litre bottle, as well as a decently sized door pocket for, you know, wallets and other bits and bobs. And you have a decently sized glove box in here, which is big enough to fit the owner's manual and service book. And of course, there's a wireless charger up here, which is what you'll be using most, since, like I said, this car comes with wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. But obviously, if you ask me, the most special part about this interior is the GR Start-Stop button, because that's where the fun begins. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, when we had the GR Yaris on test, the back seats were usable basically for people with no legs or very, very small children. And so if that was too impractical for you, this is a far more practical idea, simply because, as you can see, I have a decent amount of knee room and a decent amount of headroom despite that forged carbon roof. And if you ask me, because of the way these seats are mounted, I can actually sit quite comfortably even if a driver is sat further back. This setup for my driving position leaves plenty of knee room, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, I can tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me because the front seats are mounted quite high. Now, this is supposed to be a 5-seater, which means you can technically sit 3 abreast back here, but you really wouldn't want to because the central tunnel is quite high and this seat is also quite narrow. That said, the outer seats are quite nicely scalloped and they still come with that lovely microfiber material, which means when you're sat back here, you will be sat very comfortably in place. In terms of practical requirements, of course, you have a couple of back seat pockets, and you have a couple of cup holders here in the door, although I reckon that 1.5-litre bottle I mentioned earlier is not going to fit in here. And of course, you have access to the USB-C port that I mentioned earlier. And you also get a central armrest, which has a couple more cup holders, but more importantly, it floats over the center console, which means it feels a lot more solid, and of course, the angle of it is a lot more usable. I know it's very strange to point this out, but a lot more cars are leaving it to just sort of flop now, which looks and feels quite cheap. Now, if you are trying to fit child seats back here, please note that the opening of the doors is not that wide, which means a bulky rear-facing child seat is going to take a little bit more maneuvering to get in here. And of course, if you do have this seat set up further back, that rear-facing child seat is probably going to push against this. But a forward-facing child seat should not have any issues. The ISOFIX mounts are a little bit tricky to find because they are within these sort of slits in the base of the seat, but honestly, this shouldn't be too bad. And of course, the floor is always there in order to mount the leg that comes with those child seats. But I can hear a lot of you saying now that all of this is largely irrelevant because honestly, if you were a family person looking for a family hatch, because you're weird, you'd be looking at things like the Mazda 3 instead, which is also significantly more affordable than this. This is a performance car, this is a hot hatch, and so none of this matters. Because what actually matters is what goes on here, and that starts with this. Now I'm going to get the boring stuff out of the way first because I think you're more interested in the way this car drives for enthusiasts. So the GR Corolla, even though this is ultimately a performance hatch, still comes with the usual gamut of Toyota safety sense features, which means you get radar guided cruise control with traffic jam assist, although obviously you'll still need to be shifting yourself. You still get blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, and a really crappy reverse camera, among other things. What irritates me is that this car doesn't come with an electrochromic rear view mirror, which I think at 355,000 ringgit is more than justified, which means I still have to reach out and flip the central mirror, which I find a little bit irritating. And of course, when you're driving sedately, like I am now, over usual surfaces, you will find the ride in this car is obviously not as floaty as what you get from a regular Corolla. In fact, the Corolla GR Sport is a little bit less nuggety than this, obviously. But for the most part, the GR Corolla remains quite civilized because when you're driving around normally without, your arse on fire, it just feels like a normal car. It's only when you hear that wastegate noise that you just get a little inkling that this might be a little bit more special than you might initially assume. Now, in terms of visibility, because this is again ultimately a Corolla, everything in here does look pretty good. You've got these lovely quarter lights just behind or just ahead of the rear view mirrors, which means you can see pretty well. You still get 360-degree parking sensors that you just heard going off there, and it's usable and functional. And in fact, I find that the clutch action in this car makes it very easy to use. Having been caught in a couple of traffic jams, this manual gearbox and this clutch do work pretty well. It's not nearly as torturing as what you get from the GR86. And so when you're just driving along using this car like you would any other 5-door hatchback, it's civilized and reasonable and usable, which is what you want from an ultra hatch. At 355,000 ringgit, this car goes head-to-head with vehicles like the Volkswagen Golf R, as well as the Honda Civic Type R. Now, while the Golf R is also all-wheel drive, the Civic Type R is front-wheel drive, while this car has diffs in the front and rear. Obviously, the Type R only has one in the front, which means that in terms of grip, this car has that licked too. Now, fact of the matter is, when you're talking about this particular segment, what is important is that ability to balance between the insanity, the raw performance that you get out of this, as well as the daily usability of it all. Because ultimately, again, at 355,000 ringgit, you can afford to buy things like a BMW 3 Series, for example, which is hardly a terrible car to drive, far from it, in fact. So when you're buying a hot hatch or an ultra hatch like this, you want something that can balance both worlds. And I think that the Corolla GR does that pretty well. Simply because if you want to get into a Type R, that is far more of a tool, a very precision tool in terms of driving dynamics. And what that means is when you're driving it day to day, it can get just a touch overwhelming. Whereas this stays usable no matter what. When talking about ultra hatches, it becomes very important that these cars are able to balance things just right. The Civic Type R, for example, is a fantastic machine. And in terms of driving dynamics, it is perhaps one of the sharpest tools that you can get. Whereas the Golf R, some accuse of being just a little bit too soft, a little bit too sedate, a little bit too vanilla. So when you're caught between the two, that's when you have the option of cars like this. Because when you put your foot down, not only does it absolutely take off, but this car really does come alive. The sport mode, for example, in this car changes the rev meter in it. And it just goes to show that anything below 4,000 RPM doesn't really matter. And that's why the rev meter is set up the way it is. Because it wants you to play between that 4,000 RPM and 7,000 RPM red line, because that's where this car, like I said, really comes alive. Now, I might not be able to demonstrate this as I'm about to pull onto the federal highway, but having driven this car through some slightly more challenging back roads and so on, this Corolla is something else. It starts obviously with the strong chassis. So obviously this car is built on Toyota's new global architecture, TNGA-C. This car is very well engineered against chassis flex, which means that the suspension obviously doesn't have to do that much work in order to combat that. And of course, because this car has reworked suspension, upgraded brakes, and upgraded engine, obviously, it just makes this car so much fun. Where I argued that the GR Yaris was perhaps a little bit too far one way, this car again strikes that balance beautifully. Because for example, if you were to drive to Tanjung Balim on the back roads, you'll be able to enjoy this car through those beautiful sweeps and curves. You'll be able to enjoy the technicality of driving this car, of shifting the gears yourself, of having that control. And then when you're tired, you can just take the motorway back and switch on the adaptive cruise control and all is well again. I love that duality about this car. And stepping into this, especially after having driven the GR86, I was concerned that perhaps this manual gearbox might make this car a little bit too serious, but it isn't. In fact, the gearbox in this, because obviously it's the same one that you get out of the GR Yaris, therefore dissimilar to what you get out of the GR86 and the GR Supra, is such a joy to use. You have these lovely short throws which are so beautifully precise. It's just lovely, this thing. And the best part is, it doesn't seem to come at the detriment of anything else, because yeah, you could say that road noise and wind noise is not very well suppressed, and obviously a regular Corolla is quieter, but that is not the point. This car is quieter than what you get from the Civic Type R, although it's not quite as refined as what you get from the Volkswagen Golf R, which to me, again, I think strikes a nice balance between the two. This is the manual hatchback that you can drive every day. If you were turned off by the DSG automatic that you get from the Volkswagen Golf R and you think that the Civic Type R is just a little bit too hardcore, then this is perfect. We've had this car for about a week, during which time it has swapped hands between me and Izzat, my co-presenter, and we both arrived at the same conclusion. This really does embody what you want out of a hot hatch, the ability to enjoy two sides of a personality. Oh, that engine is so wonderful. And it's so satisfying to roll through the gears yourself. I'm gonna miss this car. If you ask me, if you are a driving enthusiast and you do happen to have about 400,000 ringgit burning a hole in your pocket, then the GR Corolla is most definitely worth a look. Although it is a manual, Toyota has done a lot to make this a very usable manual, which means that even driving through traffic, it really doesn't feel like a handful. And unlike the GR Supra and the GR86, it never feels like a handful either, no matter what your mood might be, or in my case, your potential energy levels. Even downshifting in this car is so lovely. But of course, there will be some people who argue that If you want true duality, it ought to be a little bit more convenient, and for them, I'd advise that you check out the Volkswagen Golf R, because although it does have an infernal infotainment system, which I think Volkswagen Passenger Cars Malaysia has promised will be updated sometime this year, it is still a little bit annoying. If you want actual knobs and switches to control your air conditioning, then this is about it. And of course, if you test drive one of these things and you think that, well, I want it to be a little bit more chaotic, I want a little bit more in terms of driver engagement and that sensation of feeling macho, then you might want a Honda Civic Type R, which admittedly, compared to this, does look a little bit more aggro to some angles. But from a personal perspective, I prefer a car that balances both beautifully. And in terms of that balance, nothing really comes close to this GR Corolla. It is a fantastic vehicle, and this is the culmination of Akio Toyoda's vision to make Toyota interesting again. And this is not just interesting, this car is absolutely beguiling. I love this thing, and like I said, if you're in the market, you should definitely check this car out, because chances are you're going to fall in love with it as hard and fast as I have. In any case, that has been our review of the Toyota GR Corolla. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, and you can join our new WhatsApp channel. All the links are down there. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh. And if you'll excuse me, I have a quarter tank of fuel to burn.